The method used by Palmerston was used for centuries to weaken and destroy any nation by pitting race against race, interest groups against one another, or any other difference that forms a convenient basis for chaos. The United States was able to cultivate a unique identity among its citizens, despite how different they may have been from one another. It was not the unity of race, but the unity of a country that can be united around a higher conception of man as a creator. This tended to be what was severely miscalculated by the British time and time again, as they lost every battle they engaged in against the American cause. But in the 19th century, across the Atlantic, Britain was dealing with a very different identity in the people of Europe. They had been victims to empires, divisions of territories, and wars manipulated on the basis of religious belief. In the early 19th century, in addition to the British Empire, there were other empires that challenged British supremacy, such as the Habsburgs, the Ottomans, and Russia. Key to Britain's desired future as the seat of a new Roman Empire will be the destruction of these powers, but also, most importantly, they would have to destroy the United States. As it was seen by the British, you could take down a rival empire, but had to make sure that republics like America would not be put in their place. Lord Palmerston shaped this intention early in the 19th century, setting the stage for Britain to become the dominant empire in the world. For 35 years, there was scarcely a British cabinet that did not contain Lord Palmerston as Prime Minister or a Foreign Secretary. He played a major role in sowing the seeds of divisiveness that would witness 2 world wars and the Cold War, resulting in a Europe which is still weak, divided, and controlled to this day. The year is 1848. The call has gone out to the people of Europe. It is now time to rise up and declare independence. It was a revolution that threatened all the monarchies of the continent. Kings were fleeing their countries, some abdicating, some offering reforms in the face of popular insurrections. Republican uprisings occurred in Paris, Vienna, Budapest, Prague, Berlin, among many, many others. They were ready to declare themselves republics and to shake off their monarchical governments. But unfortunately, this actually is not what happened in Europe at all. Despite what some of those misled would claim, those involved, even if they had good intentions, were swept up into a cauldron of total destruction to the benefit of only the British Empire. A key agent in the 1848 revolutions in Europe was Giuseppe Mazzini. In 1831, Mazzini set up the Young Italy organization, attracting the young sailor Giuseppe Garibaldi and Louis Napoleon, who would both help Mazzini continually wreck Italian unification. Shortly thereafter, young European movements were set up all over the continent and eventually spread beyond it. Mazzini was controlled through a whole nest of British creeps in London. He had direct access to the British government payroll for his false revolutions through James Stansfield, a junior Lord of the Admiralty and a very high official of British intelligence. Then there was John Bowring of the Foreign Office, who had earlier been responsible for sparking the Second Opium War with China. Among Mazzini's British sponsors, there are many others. Mazzini would prove very useful to his controllers, preaching the ideas that terrorists would long use, that the era of Christianity, freedom, and human rights was over, because Christianity only developed the individual. Now, Mazzini said, the protagonists of history would not be individuals, but peoples, or racial nationalities. Liberty, said Mazzini, is not the negation of all authority. It is the negation of every authority that fails to represent the collective aim of the nation. And any institution which tries to bring God to man, such as the church or the papacy, had to be destroyed. Such ideas form a nice cover for what was really at play. To get the best sense of this, think about a lowly little creature, off in its comfortable habitat. It's accustomed to its territory, knows where to go for food and drink. gets into the occasional fight but knows that he is the dominant force in his environment. But the little creature doesn't know that he's in captivity, and his actions are not his own. Even if the top creature does a good job showing the others who's boss, it's ultimately the keeper at the zoo who has the upper hand. If any of the animals were to fall into the same pit and get into a fight, it would solely be the zookeeper who'd have the fault. In our story, the zookeeper is Palmerston, and we will pay a visit to two other inmates among many at the Palmerston'S Zoo. Napoleon III had been a fixture in Mazzini's networks, contributing articles to his magazine and eventually attempting to stage a coup in France before being exiled. During this time, he was kept in close company with Lord Palmerston, who frequented his study located inside the British Museum. He was at work writing a book called The Napoleonic Ideas, where he criticized his uncle Napoleon Bonaparte, not for being an imperialist, but for trying to expand an empire at the expense of Great Britain. In 1848, among the tumult of popular revolutions, Napoleon pulled off a coup, this time successful, establishing himself as Emperor of France. This new junior partner in the British Empire would join Palmerston in fighting one of the empire's main targets for destruction, Russia. But although Napoleon and Mazzini would both be bedfellows of Palmerston, that common interest wouldn't extend past London. Napoleon would be used to suppress Mazzini's phony revolution, and Mazzini would be used to attempt to assassinate Napoleon twice. These assassination attempts would be financed by none other than Sir James Stansfield of the Admiralty. England brings forth its own dupe, David Urquhart. Urquhart was a British aristocrat, member of Parliament, ambassador and controller of the weekly newspaper, The Free Press. After serving time as British ambassador to Constantinople, becoming an Ottoman pasha, and also starting a harem, he concludes that late Ottoman feudalism was a model that civilization ought to be. He promoted the idea that England was better clothed and fed before the introduction of industrialism, and that further improvements in technology were what produced falling rates of profit. In Turkey, Urquhart developed his geopolitical conception of all evil in the world having a single root, Russia. A very convenient view for Palmerston. For Urquhart, the unification of Italy was a Russian plot. He once met Mazzini and concluded after just 10 minutes that Mazzini was a Russian agent. What Urquhart expounded would be picked up by a young employee of his named Karl Marx, who joined him in his attacks on Palmerston. The accusations of Palmerston's Russian agentry would be expounded upon in Karl Marx's biography of him titled The Life of Palmerston. These machinations worked well for the British, but without the destruction of the United States, empire would be made obsolete. Palmerston's Zoo strategy of divisiveness in this same period worked its way over to the United States, where it threatened to destroy the Union in the form of the Southern Confederacy. The Young America movement was brought to the United States by Edwin de Leon, chief Confederate propagandist in Europe and the closest advisor to Confederate President Jefferson Davis. In his 1845 speech entitled The Positions and Duties of Young America, he expounded on the idea of extending the area of freedom, which meant conquering the Western Hemisphere, Spain's colonies, and also the independent nations alike, to convert all of America into a slave plantation, and aiding the revolutionary anarchist Giuseppe Mazzini. Edward de Leon would later write in his memoirs that the relation between the white and black races, master and slave, in the southern states were partly patriarchal and partly feudal, and the plantation Negro was a revival in some respect of the English serf, conquered and enslaved by the victorious Norman. The other side of the Young America movement was abolitionism, equally effective in splitting the United States and overthrowing real republics. We look to the work of William Lloyd Garrison, who was known for sending free subscriptions of his paper, The Liberator, to Southern pro-slavery newspapers in order to fuel the fire of hatred and tension. This tension, he thought, would produce the irrepressible conflict and breakup of the United States. In a speech given in England and reprinted in the London Patriot in 1833, he called the U.S. Constitution the most bloody and heaven-daring arrangement ever made by men for the continuance and protection of the most atrocious villainy ever exhibited on earth. But Garrison would also be a great admirer of Giuseppe Mazzini, writing the introduction to Mazzini's autobiography, where he reminisced about their close friendship years later. Such are a sampling of the inmates at Palmerston'S Zoo. Now let us reflect for a moment on the most important individual in this period. If Lincoln had not been smart enough to have known what the methods of the British really were, he probably would have answered that most famous trick question differently: abolish slavery or preserve the Union. He said preserving the Union was ultimately more important because without the Union, we would all be slaves in Palmerston's Zoo. As the nations of Europe were made prostrate with the revolutions of the 1840s, the United States was not with the Civil War. Millions were sent onto the battlefields. Thousands died. But rather than halting the progress of development, Lincoln expanded it. What would be the point of winning a war if the immense nation was not quickly developed in order to secure a lasting union? The war did not end on the fields of battle, but continued in the very development of the nation. It was as the war raged on that Lincoln pushed forward the Transcontinental Railroad, the very project that would then see the blue and gray working side by side to build it after the war. In little over 10 years' time from the war's end, the same nations that would be destroying one another in Europe would come to see the progress of the United States and the promise of their nations at the Centennial Exhibition. But they knew that could only happen if they could escape from Palmerston's Zoo. As Americans bicker over political nonsense, a distinct enemy threatens all of humanity. Without the cultivation of our powers as a nation through continental development, no less ambitious than Lincoln, we are subject to division and destruction worse than what we saw in 1848. Unless you consider yourself an animal, rise to the occasion, as Americans have done before. Don't divide yourselves around issues or events. Ensure that we'll have a nation to hand off by acting on the highest principle of what the United States represents. Take your example from Lincoln. The fight may be long and hard, but it's the only way you won't be a captive in Palmerston's Zoo.